I don't usually cover books like this, but I found this book quite interesting. Eye-catching title, Fearvana, The Revolutionary Science of How to Turn Fear into Health, Wealth, and Happiness. And it kind of accorded with some personal experiences I've had, for better and worse. So here to talk about it with us now is the author Akshay Nanavati. He's a Marine Corps veteran. He is a speaker. He's an adventurer. He does all sorts of things. And, of course, he is the author of this book I am holding in my hand. So, first of all, Akshay, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Oh, well, pleasure's all mine. What led you to write this book?
Some of my experiences, it actually started with after I came back from the war. A few years later, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And I got to a point where I was really struggling with alcohol. And after one 5-day binge drinking session, I was on the verge of suicide. I mean, I thought this pattern would never end. And that was obviously a pretty low moment. And the fact that I would think that, I realized something needed to change. So I began researching neuroscience, psychology, spirituality, ultimately, I mean, initially to heal my own brain, but then to kind of figure out how do we all live a happy and meaningful life? Because, of course, I'm not the only one struggling and suffering, right? And that led me to this concept of Fearvana. And then writing the book was about sharing it with the world, because it led me to this idea of how we find bliss, how we find growth, how we find enlightenment, ultimately. And everything that I'd experienced up to that point validated from my adventures around the world, from serving in the Marines, and validated this concept that fear was the pathway to bliss.
So did you study any religious traditions or other practices in order to get to this point? How much of this was picked up from other disciplines and how much was just personal experimentation?
It was definitely a lot of personal experience because, I mean, even before that, in high school, I'd struggled with drug addiction, lost 2 friends to that, got out, joined the Marines, did 6 years in the Marines, 1 tour in Iraq. I've climbed mountains in the Himalayas, skied across polar ice caps, scuba dive, cave dive, you name it. So that was personal experience that I brought into this experience of fear and my relationship with fear. But I also studied with more spiritual, so kind of Buddhism a little bit more versus religious traditions, and a lot of the science as well, neuroscience and psychology. So I incorporated life experience, interviews with many other amazing people, and the science and spirituality to kind of validate everything in the book. So, each point is proven and tested as well in the battlefield, literally and metaphorically.
One of the reasons why I connected with the book was that, first of all, at various times, I too have struggled with many of the same issues you describe. And so that was a connection. And one of the things that I found in my own sort of journey through all of this is that at one point, at various points in my life, I did what might be described as very reckless things, life-endangering things. Flew ultralights, whether it was that kind of aircraft or simply was reckless as a driver, which I'm very remorseful now because of what could have happened, or, drinking and substances and all of that stuff to excess. I mean, I haven't had a drink in 22 years, for example, or a drug. So obviously I had issues there.
Yeah.
But one of the things that struck me about it is that I used to say that I wasn't afraid of death. And once I started to straighten myself out a little bit, I started to experience the feeling of being afraid of death. And I started to think, well, maybe there's another mechanism at work here. Maybe it wasn't so much, maybe it was more that I was afraid of living. Do you get a sense of what I'm driving at here?
I do. I think the fear of death is actually a really good thing and a necessary thing. I mean, when I do some of these risky things, I want to have the fear of death because that allows you to then prepare to stay alive. One thing I always say is that fear propels you to prepare. So I like having the fear of death, and I like engaging our mortality. I think the closer we are to our own mortality, the more we live a full life, because most of us live our whole lives never thinking about our death, right? But if you actually imagine, I'm not talking about living every day it's like it's your last, because if you did, then why would I work hard on something, right? Because I would just go crazy if it's my last day. But I mean truly being present to your own mortality and remembering that I will die soon, and being afraid of that is a good thing. I actually really I meditate on death, and a lot of Buddhist practice talks about that, as you know, meditating on our own mortality. So I think it's a great thing to be afraid of death.
And again, we're talking with Akshay Nanavati, author of Fearvana. And, I've studied some of those spiritual practices too and written about them. And I go back to an experience I had free climbing in Yosemite, in the Yosemite Valley. It's not something I did a lot of.
Yeah.
And, it began with a guy was taking me up, And we got to a very tricky part, and I said, is this going to be a problem? Because I was getting a little nervous. There was a plunge. He said, well, if you choose to make it a problem. And I remember thinking, oh, great. My life's in danger, and I'm up here with effing, Khalil Gibran, right? But there was a moment where I reached my hand up for a hold that, my life depended on getting it right? Yeah. And as I grabbed that little tiny lid of a rock, a lizard jumped out. And I still think that instant, my sense perception has probably never been more heightened than it was. It was just an extraordinary experience. Yeah. Is that an aspect of what you're talking about? I know it's not the whole thing, but is it a dimension of it?
Definitely. I mean, I used to free solo myself, right? Like free climb without rope. And obviously the line of risk on that is extremely high. So I think it's about managing that risk of where you are. I mean, there's still a lot of rock climbers who free solo. Many have perished as a result, but there's still people who do it. So I think there's no one right line of risk. It depends, Ever since I got married, I promised my wife I won't do that anymore. But at the same time, I'm going to go back mountaineering in the Himalayas. I'm going to pursue other risks. I want to go skiing to the South Pole and the North Pole, various adventures. So I think it's about finding our own line of risk and pushing that. And then ultimately it requires a lot of self-awareness to realize when you got to stop pushing that line. Because as I said, there's a lot of people who push that line too far and perish as a result, And then it's a question, do you died for doing what you love? But I don't know. It's
I've totally, just so you know, I've totally backed off anything like openly life-threatening. I've got kids. I've got, my first wife actually bought me a gift certificate to do more ultralight flying, and my mother said she's trying to kill you. But and you mentioned, your book has an endorsement from the Dalai Lama, which is as good as it gets in that business. His branch of Buddhism, they meditate on death, as you talk about doing. They sleep in graveyards and so on. A lot of people will think about that and say, well, isn't that, and the Sufis and Muslims I've known have also said, same thing, be conscious of death at every moment and that kind of, because it heightens your ability to live. But I think some people will hear that and say, kind of morbid. What would you say to that?
I don't think death has to be a morbid thing. I mean, it's an inevitable part, right? It's guaranteed we're all going to die. So why does it have to be morbid? I mean, when people die, celebrate their life. I mean, one thing I know is that I'm going to continue pushing risky activities. And my wife knows that. And yes, the line of risk is lower. Like I said, I won't free solo. But I mean, if I die, at the age of 40, I would rather die then having lived a full life. Really a full life than die at 80 and never having truly lived, So I don't think it's morbid. I think that if we reframe our perception of death, we just see it as an inevitable thing, then it's okay. It's inevitable. And how is that, if, it's just normal and accepted part of life, then there's nothing morbid about it. It's just a beautiful thing when we accept it, embrace it, and channel it into living a full and meaningful life.
And living each moment fully. There's another dimension to all this, too, in terms of facing one's fear. And I've faced a lot of fears. I mean, my life now, the biggest danger I have on a daily basis is that someone will write a mean tweet about me. But there's an old country and western song that called "What Can You Do to Me Now?" That you haven't done already. That if you face pain, if you face death, if you face loss, all the things that people consider negative, I find there can be something empowering in that.
Yeah.
Is that part of what you're talking about here too?
I've definitely faced death on my own life, but also I've lost friends through drug addiction. I lost a friend in the war, and that guilt that I felt. For example, when I came back from the war, I felt a lot of guilt, the survivor's guilt, that it should have been me that died instead of him. And that tore me up for a while. It drove me to drinking. It drove me to a lot of dark places. But I've learned to reframe that death. Okay, that my guilt now is my ally. For example, I have a picture of my friend up on my wall, and it says, "This should have been you. Earn this life." So now my guilt drives me to stay sober, to do something meaningful. And I want to honor his death. We all lose people at some point or another. And it's up to us to decide whether we want to make their, sort of lose the value of their death and, dishonor it with our own sort of guilt and losing it and, not living a full life, or honor their death. And that's what I choose to do now. That, okay, if I truly believe it should have been me instead of him, I couldn't change the fact that it isn't. I'm here, I'm alive. Let me honor his death and let me do something meaningful with this life that I truly believe I've been gifted, when I think that I should have died. And I should have died many times. In fact, I found out in Iraq that our vehicle rolled over an active IED, improvised explosive device, but just didn't happen to explode for some reason. So, have had experiences like that. And then it's just, now it's up to me to honor the life that I've been gifted. And I think death reminds us of that.
Yeah, I think it does too. And I think that you also talk, by the way, I do want to talk a little bit about the neuroscience, because you go into that. This is the subjective, if you will. What we've been talking about is a subjective experience. What does science tell us about all of this?
The biggest thing in terms of the neuroscience of fear is that neuroscience has shown we don't control what first shows up in our brain. It's just a matter of our genetics and everything that's brought us up to now, our perception of life, our everything that's shaped who we are. So the value in recognizing that, and this is sort of the fundamental concept, it's the first 2 chapters of the book, is that if we don't control what first shows up in the brain, there are no bad or good emotions. Fear, stress, anxiety, guilt, anger. That's not negative emotions. They're just emotions because often we don't control them. I mean, if I'm standing on the edge of a cliff and I feel fear, that's a normal human response. Right. So if we just learn to accept our emotions instead of judging them, because the biggest problem people make is they judge their emotions, right? Fear is negative. How many times do you hear people say, be fearless, don't be scared of anything? Right. And that sends people into a darker hole, because if they believe their fear makes them weak, then they run away from it, they resist it, and it goes into this downward spiral. So that was one of the most valuable concepts I learned from neuroscience, and then learning how to channel that fear. And neuroscience also shows that when you channel that fear and accept it, it actually releases a lot of powerful brain chemicals like dopamine, adrenaline, and there's another chemical called anandamide, which comes from the Sanskrit word anand, which literally means bliss. So novelty leads to bliss, and novelty is scary. Taking risks is scary. But if you just choose to believe your fear will work for you, it will. And plenty of studies have shown that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I hadn't heard of anandamide before. Anandamine, is that how it's
anandamide, I believe, yeah.
Anandamide. But that would explain my experience with the lizard on the rock, wouldn't it? Because that was an ecstatic experience.
Oh, yeah,
right. And I guess just so you know, just since we're just talking here, my own relationship with risk now is that I will take any risk for my work. I'm more than willing to be placed. I literally don't have a fear of death at this point. There are injuries I fear, but not death. I tried to get a magazine to send me to Afghanistan, and they said, for a scandal I wanted to investigate, they said, too dangerous. I said, I've arranged the protection of a warlord. The editor said, I don't want to send you any place where you need to arrange the protection of a warlord. Yeah. I've met your family. I don't feel good about it. Yeah. But I don't have, but I don't seek danger anymore. Should I?
I don't think it has to be danger in terms of a risk of life. Like you said, you take risks in your business. And I think for each of us, we have our own version of risk that we want to take, and there's no right level, You don't have to ski across an ice cap or climb a mountain. That's not at all what I'm preaching. That's what I do. The point that I make, especially in this book and in Fearvana in general, is that find your own version. I call it your own worthy struggle. We all have our own worthy struggle. It could be playing chess, which is not dangerous. I know people who are chess players and they get scared every time they enter a game. It could be playing sports, writing movies, running marathons, anything. It could be raising a child, which that's my next big terrifying thing that I'm going to pursue. So whatever it is, but like you said, you still take risks in your business, and that's now your worthy struggle. Mine might change, when I get kids, maybe my level of risk will change even lower than it is now. So find your own worthy struggle, and whatever it is, that worthy struggle will lead you to your bliss. But it doesn't have to be danger by any means in terms of life danger.
Oh, that's very interesting. Sure, because we all face danger getting on a stage or going on the radio. I mean, some people. So, all right. Well, the book is Fearvana, The Revolutionary Science of How to Turn Fear into Health, Wealth, and Happiness. The author is Akshay Nanavati. Akshay, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It was an honor.
Likewise.